Hey everybody, Caleb Rothy, Percussion Education Coordinator here. We're going to talk a little bit today with Chris Heston, the Judge Coordinator for the Percussion Division. He and I are going to talk a little bit about classification. This is going to be the fourth installment in our ongoing series on classification. Before you proceed, I would like you to pause the video and really quickly go back and review parts 1, 2, and 3, just to make sure that those are fresh in your mind, all the things that we talk about in terms of the various skill sets and what we look for and how we're going to be evaluating the appropriate classification for each group. I know at this point in the season, a lot of groups are getting notifications saying that the feedback that they need is more consistent with the next level up than what they've been participating in. And that's often a daunting process for quite a bit. We'll talk about that in a future video segment about how to get prepared for the elevation to the next class. But I think what Chris and I want to do today is give everybody a little bit of insight into what we look for when defining classification decisions and when we really evaluate what should A class look like, what should open class look like, what should world class look like, and deciding when a group perhaps doesn't fit the paradigm that they're currently enrolled in. Chris, thank you very much for being with us today.
Caleb, good to see you again.
Great to see you as well. I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about one of the key things that you look for when evaluating a group. I know you and I have talked about this quite a bit in the past, and we're kind of on the same page with what differentiates it for us.
Yeah, I think the key word for me, and as we go forward with a lot of these reviews, it's maturity. It's the maturity of the main performer. It's the maturity of the collective ensemble, and then a close second, if not second, would be just the maturity of the design. But by and large, it comes down to the individual performer, the maturity of their musicianship, the maturity of just their physical stature, being able to control the equipment, being able to communicate. That starts when you project it across the three paradigms. You start to get a good feel for what is beginning, what is intermediate, what is advanced.
Yeah, for me, that's always typically the biggest indicator of whether or not a group is ready for the next level of expectations and ready for the next paradigm shift, is that innate maturity that the mean performer, maybe not just one or two, but the average performer in the ensemble, what they're demonstrating in that performance that we view, either you know, via recorded means or viewing it live in person. Also pointing out that what we're always looking for is the skill set of the performers, what they're being asked to do, and their ability to demonstrate that on the floor. That doesn't necessarily always have a lot to do with the excellence of the show design or the compositional excellence or the quality of additional stuff, props and floors and costumes and all that. That really the primary thing that we're evaluating is the skill set that the performers are able to exhibit on the floor, and maturity, I think, is one of the easiest ways to really hone in quickly on what that skill set looks like.
Yeah, I think with the skill set, I think you hit it. It's more the achievement of that skill set. Because just because the performers were handed certain responsibilities that are beyond them, just because they're playing those responsibilities, wouldn't necessarily mean they're ready for the next class. It's how they can internalize them, how they can apply them. Again, going back to the maturity level of how well they're achieving those skills, not just a nuts and bolts list of responsibilities. Sure.
And the flip side of that sometimes is you will see groups that you know, have been given moderate responsibilities, but their ability to take that and communicate that to the audience, what they're able to add to it in terms of the expressive qualities and the mature qualities that go along with some of the content, really can elevate the performance quite a bit. So it's really, for me, and I think for Chris as well, it's really the marriage of those two things at the same time. How do those two interact, and how do the performers communicate that and convey that to the audience? Mm-hmm. Good. One of the other things I wanted to talk about, we at this point of the season, and we're recording this late in the season. We're right on the eve of our last regional events for this year. We hear from a lot of groups at this point in the season that you know, maybe they get a notification that they're inconsistent with the expectations for that current paradigm, and they immediately start pointing to DVDs from past years. They immediately go, hey, you know, looking at the A-class finalists from last year. One of the myths that I'd like to dispel is whether or not last year's DVDs are a true, accurate barometer of any of the classes. I think it's important that everybody remember that those groups that they're looking at represent the 12 or 15 best in the world in that particular paradigm, and that's not always a great way to evaluate what that class looks like in totality. Also really important to point out that a lot of those decisions, those classification decisions, are made you know, more than 3 weeks before that World Championship event happens. So I know every single season, Chris, you and I see a couple of groups on the floor at World Championships where we go, man, the amount that they've grown in the last 3 weeks since we've seen them probably moves them up to the point where they are now displaying things that exceed basic expectations or exceed intermediate expectations.
Sure.
And by the time they get to World Championships, a number of those performances, I think, are more consistent with what we would expect in the next class level up. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah, because you'll have ensembles that backload their rehearsal schedules with regards to taking advantage of spring break, taking advantage of a certain amount of time, taking advantage of basketball season being over, being in the gym 5 straight days, those types of things that can really accelerate. And again, of course, we do our best to identify where that maturity is as early in the season as possible, but just the way the calendar lays out, sometimes it isn't until March that we even see a group to be able to ascertain. Yeah.
And I think another thing for me is that even watching the whole class at World Championships won't give you a true feel for what that class looks like, again, in totality. Because at World Championships, you're just seeing the groups that have made the trek out to the WGI World Championship. So this is already going to represent usually the upper echelon of A class, the upper echelon of open class, the upper echelon of world class. And that to get a true feel for what each one of those classes looks like, you really have to have something like a fan network subscription and be looking at all the different regionals, looking at the champion at the regional as well as the lower placing finalists. And in a perfect world, even the groups that are not advancing to finals at all those different regionals, to get a feel for what does the totality of basic skills look like, what does the totality of intermediate skills look like. So some of those groups that are on the cusp of moving from A to open would immediately maybe perhaps look at the DVD and go, well, I'm not sure that that my ensemble is really ready to hang with the top 12 in the world. Maybe not. Maybe that's not a realistic goal for the ensemble. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that basic expectations are the appropriate paradigm to be applied to the ensemble.
Right. Yeah. That's one of the phenomenon I'd love to address is just that the fact that appropriate classification doesn't guarantee relative competitiveness in the next class. It would just mean that you're appropriately classified. So that can be a little frustrating for the staffs. But again, as we're such staunch advocates of the 3-tiered system that we work within, trying to, especially to protect that A class to be truly basic. We really work hard to make sure that's appropriately classified. And the flip side of that phenomenon is even when faced with that daunting task of being reclassified, there are shows that transcend classes that would be equally as effective, that connect with the audience. We've reclassified groups from A to open, and they're silver medalists in the same year, just because the show. I guess the dark side of that is, and something else that exposes is, say perhaps we would reclassify a group, the second and third place group, but not the first place group at a regional. I mean, again, the maturity is going to define the classification. The judges are still going to be accountable, holding the groups accountable to their criteria and how well they played. So that first class group that stays in A might just be purely maturity A class basic. But the other two are clearly ready for more. Perhaps it didn't have the strongest show. Perhaps the show wasn't finished. Perhaps the show didn't connect with the audience and it wasn't as effective as they meant for it to be that day. Just some phenomenon that exposed themselves throughout the season that I know some people have questions about. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that when you and I and Mark Thurston, we are the admin team that initially launches the review process and takes a look at, probably 80 groups or so each season in terms of their classification and what's most appropriate for those groups. That the competitive aspects are of little concern to us at all. We don't really take a look at the spreads from an event or the placement from an event. We kind of just blanket watch as many different groups as possible and start to identify the ones that have maturity that exceeds the current paradigm that they're enrolled in. That may be a group that won a regional. It may not be. It may be a group, like you said, that came in second or third. That still means that, it's still perfectly possible to exhibit skills and abilities that are more consistent with the next class up and not necessarily win your class. The scoring and the competition aspect are completely separate from the educational tiered system that we've set up. That we should advance groups through different stages of development of their ensemble. So it's really important to remember that the competitive aspects are of little consequence, both in how did you do at this event, does that determine whether or not you should go up? No, it has, quite frankly, nothing to do with it. And also, if you move up, how would you do in the next class? That's not ever anything that we really look at. The idea is to group all of the basic skill ensembles together, group all the intermediate skill ensembles together, group all the advanced skill ensembles together, and then let them have their competitions and let the process work to see who displayed, the best use of intermediate skills or the best use of basic skills at any given competition.
And understanding that ideally there's going to be breadth of ensembles across each of those three paradigms.
Yeah.
We would not just reclassify a group into open because we think they'll be in a box 5 tier in open necessarily. It just means they're appropriately classified somewhere on that learning curve.
Somewhere in that spectrum, and it's broad. And as the activity grows and has evolved over the last 10, 15 years, the classes have gotten deeper and deeper and deeper. And I think that's important to keep in mind when your ensemble might be up against this classification dilemma, that there's a lot more depth in those classes than you will see by just looking at one small slice of a particular class, or setting your goal as, I want to be a medalist, or I want to be a finalist, or whatever your current goal may be. I know one of the other things that often throws people for a loop is that we have an aspect of our scoring system that also triggers readiness for the next class, and that's the box 6 criteria on an A class or an open class sheet. And a lot of people feel like if they go to a regional and they should be an open class, that means they should expect to see box 6 scores from all 3 judges in that particular thing. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the way that we utilize box 6 and kind of its purpose in the current configuration of the sheets.
Sure. Again, going back to the fact that the classification can be based on the maturity of the group, but the judges will still have to do their rating and ranking based on the criteria and how well the ensemble performed. So only when the ensemble is satisfying all of the box 5 considerations, and then even applying beyond that, are the judges excited to and free to reward those ensembles with those 96, 7, 8, 9 numbers. It doesn't mean that it's not a direct ticket to the next class necessarily, but it means looking ahead, not only the program looking ahead, but if the season had been another month longer or wherever we were in that timeline, that right now the ensemble seems to be ready for more responsibilities. They're maxing out what basic responsibilities they have, and they seem to be ready for more.
And certainly early season and mid season, it would be impractical with incomplete shows and performances that, still clearly this ensemble has a month left to rehearse. They may be ready for the next class, and that, they may not be anywhere near a box 6 score yet, because of just where they are in their development cycle. So, it would be inappropriate early season, mid season to necessarily be using that as the only way that we can signify to a group, hey, you're misclassified and you're more appropriately fit within this next paradigm. Great. Chris, anything else you want to share with everybody today?
I think that covers a lot of the bases. Yeah.
Excellent. Chris, thank you very much for getting together with me. I know this is a tricky issue for a lot of people. And a lot of people feel like they have a lot riding on it because you're experiencing a certain amount of success in the activity over the course of the season. You build up a lot of expectations for what you want your end result goals to be. And then when you get the word that you're experiencing a lot of success perhaps in an A-class paradigm, but using intermediate skills, that can often be a very daunting task to feel like you need to move up into the next thing. We're here to try to make that transition as smooth as possible. But I think the most important thing for you and I, and I think we can speak on behalf of Mark as well, is that we maintain the integrity of the educational models that we have set up, keeping A-class truly basic, keeping open class truly intermediate, and making sure that the world class truly represents the advanced and elite ensembles in our activity. Thank you very much for being with us.
Protecting that A-class with trying to get as many ensembles as possible to participate in the activity and not be afraid to come to an event. Having that A-class protected goes a long way.
Absolutely. Chris, thank you very much.
Pleasure, Caleb. Take care.
Take care.